We'll go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce to you all Dr. Sarah Lubienski. She is a professor of mathematics education at Indiana University. Her research focuses on diverse students' mathematics outcomes and the policies and practices that shape those outcomes. Dr. Lubienski is co-chair of the Research in Mathematics Education SIG of AERA, as well as a member of the AERA Grants Governing Board. She has served as director of several AERA Institutes on Statistical Analysis for Education Policy. Her work has been funded by the Institute of Education Sciences, the National Center of Education Statistics, and the National Science Foundation, and the Fulbright Program. She recently served as associate and then interim dean of the University of Illinois Graduate College before moving to Indiana University in Bloomington. You all feel welcome.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. I feel like I've come to Mecca now, the Math Ed Mecca. I had never been to Georgia, so I'm not the university, so it's great. And now that I'm in Indiana, it's nice to see where most of my colleagues came from. So excellent. Seem to just come and raid this place when we meet people, which is great. Just to give you a sense of where we're going, and while there's like 5 screens with all of this, hopefully you can see one of them, and I hope that the print's not too small on some of these slides. But I'll start out just talking about some of the dilemmas of just studying equity with large-scale data sets. And then I'm going to be weaving together, like, what are some strengths and limits of national data sets for doing research in equity in math, and math ed more general. And those strengths and limits will kind of come out as I talk through various studies I've done of the NCTM reforms, of Common Core standards, the private schools and math instruction, and then gender. And then I'll just close with a little bit about here's how ways to access different NCES data sets. And so hopefully does that all make sense? Feel free to interrupt me at times if you have questions. Otherwise, I'll plow through the 80 slides. I wish I were exaggerating, but I have. We'll be fine. We may just skip some of it. So in terms of the dilemmas of studying equity with large-scale data sets, there was an exchange in JRME that Rochelle Gutierrez and I had about this issue. And I just want to acknowledge that there are drawbacks to doing this type of work. I mean, you can strengthen stereotypes when you're reporting out on, here are the gaps yet again. Test scores are certainly a limited measure of learning. They're one measure, one point of time that kids take the test. And then, the argument that even if we achieve equal test scores, if kids don't feel like, that test reflects what they care about, if they feel like they have to sacrifice their identity in order to do that, are we reaching equity? So there's some real issues there. Some counter-arguments that I want to make is that the gaps in test scores, whatever their limits, do have serious consequences for kids. And so if we just ignore them, I don't think that's serving kids well either. Detailed analyses of instructional and item-level disparities can help us understand where disparities in achievement come from, and they also can help us target interventions. And gaps analyses have laid the foundation for a lot of things, such as Head Start. And so they give us concrete grounds to make arguments to policymakers about things. And I'll also argue that if math ed researchers don't offer analyses of national policy or national data trends, other people will speak for us, and we may not like how they're interpreting those data. There's examples of that with the NCTM Standards and other things where people look at the data and go, see, what we see is very different. So, and I might allude to some examples of that in a second. So now I just want to launch into the NCTM reforms, including the potential impact on achievement and instruction in the US and disparities by race and ethnicity as those reforms are rolled out. So since some of you may not have been born when the NCTM Standards first came out, I won't do that. There were 4 sets of standards. You were all hopefully born the last time the 2000 standards came out. And there's a sort of a theme through these of emphasizing 5 different strands. That math is no longer just about number and computation, maybe a little geometry, but these 5 different strands, and math reasoning and problem solving, and this idea of mathematical power for all students. And so it makes sense to say, well, we had this huge reform effort in the US. What happened to US math achievement and instruction after those standards came out? And how can we look at that at a national level? So one way to look at this is looking at NAEP data. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress is sometimes called the nation's report card. there's two different NAEPs, but using NAEP is arguably the best for tracking what do students know about mathematics in our country. The main NAEP is different than the long-term trend NAEP. The main NAEP actually reconfigured itself, or in 1990 it established this framework that's very much aligned with the NCTM standards. So the same 5 strands of NCTM are the 5 strands of the NAEP framework. The long-term trend NAEP, though, has not changed since 1973 in terms of its content. Heavy computation focused, no calculators allowed. It's still very much a traditional old test. Its future is actually iffy. They started to ask, do they need this? And if so, can it be tucked into the main NAEP as they administer it instead of doing this whole separate administration? So, yeah, we'll see. It last was given in 2012. So again, main NAEP has some strengths. It's sensitive to curricular trends, but I would say not overly so. So they don't like change it every year so that you can't follow anything. So, but it is more aligned with things that those in the math ed community generally care about. And it uses a representative sample of U.S. kids, and so you can say, well, what has happened to achievement since 1990? First, since these reforms really started rolling out. And what do you notice? General up or general down, or general flat? General up, okay, and it may not look like much, but to go from 213 to 242, or 260 to 285, I used to have the standard deviations of this memorized, but this 4th grade jump is like the full standard deviation jump. That's a big jump that occurred over that time. 12th grade is a little more difficult because they did change the framework of 12th grade and started a whole new scale just for 12th grade. So that we really can't say a lot. It wasn't looking quite as encouraging over here to start with. I might say a little more about 12th grade in a bit, but and then there's a new scale that started. So it's harder to talk about the effect at 12th grade. But in general, over 4th and 8th grade, things looked good. Well, why such improvement? Does it have anything to do with NCTM? Well, one thing to know is that it was specific to math. If you look at reading scores in that same time frame, up, down, or flat? Flat. Okay, so there was no improvement in reading like there was in math. Okay? And basically, if you think about what's on the main NAEP test, it was things like probability statistics, which had not been taught before. And so there were these things on the main NAEP that hadn't been taught before, and as we started rolling out this new, not only we had the NCTM standards, but a lot of states aligned their standards to NCTM. So there were all these trickle downs of curricula trying to align with those standards. Kids do learn what we teach them in some way. And so it makes sense that as we're rolling out this reform, that kids would start to do better on this NAEP test that was testing things that hadn't been taught much before, but now were. If we look at the long-term trend NAEP results during that time period we're talking about starts here at 1990. So things have been rolling along. Then what happens during this 90s time period? The 90s go from here to here, and that's where we were seeing some growth in the main NAEP, which was more sensitive to NCTM. Here, we're seeing flatness, right? It's flat, which makes sense, because what does the long-term trend NAEP assess? Computation. So this is where one of these spin and counterspin was happening. So Tom Lovelace, for example, started saying, look, things have been starting to improve, and then NCTM came in and it was flat, whereas math ed people were going, look, we got these amazing gains on the main NAEP. It's awesome we didn't lose ground here, right? So you want some math ed people looking at this because you will have different spins on this. Now, there was a bump here and there was a bump also in the main NAEP. Did you notice that? What is this time period? 99 and then 04. No Child Left Behind. Okay, so I remember being with some NCTM folks when the main NAEP results came out after the No Child Left Behind kicked in, and there was this bump up. NCTM folks wanted to say, awesome, NCTM has finally kicked in enough that we see some real gains. The folks in Capitol Hill were saying, look, No Child Left Behind is kicked in and it's awesome. I have my own opinion. But it's there, a bump in both of them. So the strengths of main NAEP, another one is that there are huge sample sizes that allow us to do subgroup analyses. Once states were basically required to do NAEP, we have over 100,000 kids at each grade level to, basically analyze. So, and because it's not a longitudinal test, there's no attrition. Every year is fresh, and we have these 100,000 kids at the different grade levels. So it allows us to look at things like race and ethnicity and examine what's happened with gaps. Here's the no child left behind jump in the main NAEP. And you do see a little gap closure there that hadn't been happening the rest of the time. Is this schools paying attention to kids that, what the bubble kids or kids that maybe were getting ignored before? Perhaps. Schools suddenly have to report out by race and ethnicity. Is that putting pressure on the schools to actually supplement in summer and things? I think there's some literature to say yes, that happened. I want to show another angle on this though. If we just look at 4th grade, and we look at where the white kids started in 1990, and then you look where our Black and Hispanic students are in 2014, they're actually higher than the white kids were. And what I like to say with this slide is, it's not that these gaps are inevitable, it's not that kids couldn't learn the content and do well enough, they did. It's just that those white kids also went up because reforms are rolling out to everyone. But it's a story of there's real improvement there. Another strength of main NAEP is that there are student, teacher, and administrator surveys that are administered. And so we can learn some things about instruction, what's happening in the classroom. So have the NCTM reforms really reached all students? Once you get into the data, you get frustrated by what questions are not asked, which I'll mention in a second, but you can tell some things, like teachers of Black and Hispanic students are at least as likely as teachers of white students to say that kids use manipulatives in their classroom, that students work in groups, and they spend time in math instruction. But there are differences in places where we can say this might be one reason for the disparities we see. Black 8th graders are 40% more likely than white 8th graders to have a math teacher who's not fully certified. And Black students are also more likely to have a new teacher. And if you look at data on new teachers, they're just not quite as effective in those first couple of years. I mean, that's typically the story you'd see. So, from the student belief surveys, we can also learn things about kids' agreement with statements such as learning math is mostly memorizing facts. And this is my all-time favorite variable. I think it's telling whether kids think that that's what math is or not. I think that tells us a lot about the kinds of experiences they've had in learning math. So my question for you is, who's most likely to agree with that statement? 4th, 8th, or 12th graders? Let's start with that. Who's most likely to agree that math is just memorizing facts, or mostly memorizing facts? Some are saying 12th graders? Because schools have had more years to ruin them? Is that? Okay. How about white students or Black students? Black students? Okay, so let's take a look. I'm answering both questions with one slide. 4th graders are more likely, actually, which makes sense when you think about the curriculum in 4th grade. There's a lot of fact memorization happening in those grades. And Black students are more likely than white students to agree with this statement, suggesting that regardless of manipulative use and other things being reported by teachers, really, Black students are not having as many experiences that challenge that idea that math is just memorizing facts. So it's not, that the NCTM Standards emphasis on sense-making and reasoning perhaps is not reaching those students as much as we want. What I often want to look at with NAEP data is, well, to what extent is this about SES, right? So I created an SES variable using what is in NAEP. Some of it's a little, sketchy, like a lot of kids don't know their parents' education level, particularly at 4th grade, and so that variable has come and gone. But there are some variables there that are helpful for going, okay, here's rough SDS estimates. And so if I take the lowest and highest SES quartile of white and Black students and look at this variable, we can see that high SES white kids don't think math's memorizing facts as much as the other groups. But we still see, even though there's SES disparities within white and Black kids, still we have the highest SES Black students agreeing with that statement more than the lowest SES white students. So there's definitely, I think a lot of it's school segregation, just tracking what different experience is happening for Black students, both low and high SES. Now here's my tale of woe. this awesome variable is gone in NAEP data. They took it out. Because I would love to track it, over time and say, oh, this is getting better. Our experience is changing. But it's not there. So I complain to NCES every time I'm with NCES people. They're tired of me. We'll see. It might come back. So another strength of the main NAEP data is that it includes different types of items. There's multiple choice items. There's open-ended items. And so we can look at questions like, how are disparities different by different types of items? So one thing we can see is that omit rates for open-ended items and for non-routine problems. Disparities are larger by race and SES for omit rate for open-ended items and for non-routine problems. I'm going to give you an example about fish. So if you look at this question, Pat has 3 fish bowls. There are 4 plants, 5 fish in each bowl, which gives a total number of fish. What's difficult about this problem? Don't be shy.
No one cares about plants.
Okay, the plants are irrelevant, right? So if you've got kids who are not getting the kinds of experiences you hope in math class, where they're not being asked to reason about problems, what are they going to put for the answer? D. They're just going to pick the one with the 3 numbers. And indeed, black students were twice as likely as white students to go for that response. So there's definitely, we can see in NAEP there's disparities still in who is getting the kind of math envisioned by math ed reformers. We can also see things about misconceptions in the NAEP data. What types of, what parts of the curriculum are prone to this. So this is kind of a famous NAEP item. Now, what's the length of this toothpick? So first of all, math ed people, what is the length of this toothpick? 2.5. Okay, what are kids going to say? 10.5 or? You don't know this. Okay, the misconception. 1, 2, 3.5. They're going to count the lines, not the spaces. All right? And indeed, you can see both 10.5 and the 3.5 answers, but only 20% of 4th graders answered this item correctly, and 58% of 8th graders. So this was an open-ended item. It wasn't multiple choice. But, and there were, again, large disparities on this item as well by race and SES. So those are some examples of things you can tell about the NCTM reforms, who's maybe getting the more reform-oriented instruction, and the persistent inequities that are still there in the data that are very disturbing if you are just looking at it, with both achievement outcomes but also the types of instruction that seem to be happening in schools. We can also tell some things about Common Core, and this is going to be a brief little foray into this, but just to weave in another couple of strengths of the main NAEP, it's administered often enough to track policy trends, and there are the 5 math content strands. And so we'll see that in a second. But let me show you, you might have noticed that my graph before stopped there, and at 2013. At 2015, something happened. What happened? They went down. For the first time in a long time, the math scores went down. And what are people going to blame?
Plants.
No. Common Core. And we're going to have headlines the next day that call Common Core a fiasco. Thank you, Diane Ravitch. Brad Hassan. People from all sides of the political spectrum kind of go nuts about this. It's a train wreck. It just, the results are a train wreck. A train wreck. Okay, it went down. Okay, yeah. But for the first time in 25 years. So very concerning, apparently. So I remembered kind of talking with some other NAEP folks about what might happen with Common Core when we looked at this chart. Stats and probability are not promoted now in K-5, right? So, and NCTM used to be all about K-12 on this topic. NAEP put it in the 4th and 8th grade NAEP. Now we've got empty space here. So I had wondered with other folks what might happen to that particular strand. So what I wondered was, were the declines similar in all math strands or not? And so if you go in and break it out by strand, lo and behold, this is 4th grade. The biggest drops were in data and in geometry. I don't actually have an explanation for geometry, but I bet people who study geometry might. 8th grade, biggest drop, data and geometry again. So I wrote a thing trying to kind of say, let's calm down. There was a tiny, like less than 1.1 standard deviation drop. Instead of blanket condemnation of Common Core, let's diagnose, whether basically are we testing what we care about, and let's think about whether there's a disconnect between what we're testing and what's in Common Core, as opposed to just saying it's all a disaster. Yeah, so that is just, again, one little example, but it's nice to be able to go into NAEP and say, all right, what's really happening? And they have tools that I'm going to tell you about that let you just, like, you can do that. You could do that analysis. It's nothing special. Another area where I've used NAEP is looking at private schools and math achievement, although I did not set out to do that at all, since that's not what I was studying. I was trying to look at NCTM math teaching and achievement. And while I was doing that, I was thinking that if I'm trying to perhaps look at correlations, even though that they're not causal, but just trying to understand what's correlating with achievement, and things like learning math, mostly memorizing facts, that belief correlates with achievement, by the way. Disagreeing is better in terms of correlating with higher achievement. But in doing that, I thought I should condition on the type of school it is, because instruction and achievement might be different in public versus private. So in doing that, I got a negative estimate for private schools. And at this point, this was like a decade ago, it was very much the common wisdom that private schools are better than public. There had been really good studies from another decade before that or two that kind of put this to rest, that that's the case. So my immediate thing was, what did I do wrong, right? Did I reverse code the variable? Why am I getting a negative estimate for private schools? And so I wondered, is this actually a thing? Is this going to hold up if I dig into it? And there's a larger policy context here of pushing for charter schools, pushing for vouchers that will let students go to any private school on the taxpayer's dime. It's a big issue right now with Betsy DeVos still pushing this idea. So in digging into this a bit more with NAEP, what you can see is the darker bars are the unadjusted differences. And so this would suggest that in Catholic schools, the kids are scoring 9.5 points higher than the public school kids. Lutheran, even a little bit higher. Conservative Christian schools, not quite as much. This is other private, this is charter. But when you condition on the demographics of students, most of these bars are flipping. And so if you look at demographically similar students in Catholic schools, the public school kids are actually 7 points higher. And that's, what grade are we, fourth grade? Maybe a quarter of a standard deviation higher. But I learned quickly that this is extremely political terrain, and as soon as one tries to publish on this, people kind of go crazy, just like the Common Core thing. So a lot of people jumped on this as this is ridiculous, and maybe it's that private school kids enter private schools with lower achievement already. And with NAEP, you can't discern that because it's cross-sectional. They just test kids at 4th, test kids at 8th, test kids at 12. So there's nothing prior to grade 4 in NAEP. There's always a chicken and egg issue. For example, I feel like every year I read the same AERA proposal that says there's a correlation between calculator use and achievement at 8th grade. Yes, there is, but it's probably because 8th graders who are in the highest tracks are getting more calculator access or using it more. So you always have to be careful about the chicken and egg with cross-sectional data. And NAEP also has very limited SDS variables. It's all student self-reported. And so I decided that I should look at this with another data set. So I started using the early childhood longitudinal study, which studies, tracks kids over time, starting in kindergarten. And I also teamed up with my husband. This is a whole nother family history here, but my husband actually studies privatization of education. And so I still remember calling him when I got the negative estimate and it held up, and I was like, this is very weird. I don't know what's going to happen with this. So we worked together on this for a while. And so this ECLS K or ECLS K, it's got fewer students than NAEP, but it's still got a good strong 22,000, at least at the beginning. There's a lot of attrition as kids as they go, but they do follow people who move to some extent. And there's lots of parent questions. So they have much better, more solid SDS measures. And to make like 8 years into one slide, here's what we found. In digging into both NAEP and ECLSK data in terms of trying to find out what are things that are more prevalent in public schools and seem to predict higher achievement. And with NAEP, it truly is just a correlation. With ECLSK, we can actually predict growth with these things. So having certified teachers, more reform-oriented instruction with NAEP that shows up as not teachers having an emphasis on non-number content areas as well as number. Students' reform-oriented beliefs, things like disagreeing with that statement about memorizing math, and students liking mathematics. ECLSK, we get teacher certification again. Again, reform-oriented instruction, although it was different variables, things like having mathematical discussion in classes, problem-solving emphasis, and again, the non-number curricular strands. There are many other variables that were in there, so some of these didn't matter for achievement at all, things that you might think would matter. Time spent on math, drugs or alcohol at the school, teachers having a math major or minor at grade 8. New teachers, which I don't trust that. Here's some multiple choice tests. I don't trust this because in many other data sets, particularly that are longitudinal, it does come up as a slight, it's not huge. It's not like you lose a grade level or something for having a new teacher, but it's slight. And other things. I will say that teacher graduate degrees are in every national data set and they never matter. And that's probably depressing. But I think it's because we don't usually ask, what did you actually do in that graduate program? Whether, we don't differentiate much. Okay. So in a nutshell then my husband and I did this book. But with the ECLSK, we could look at kindergarten to 5th grade growth, and the growth in public school achievement is equal to or larger than that of demographically similar private schools. So public schools that were outscoring private in math. And the story here seemed to be, as we dug further into the data, is that there's dangers of the autonomy that the private school teachers have, and that the private schools have. So the private schools can hire who they want. They can do or not do professional development if they want. They don't have to keep up with state standards. They don't feel beholden to anyone about what they're doing in math. And so it seems like, in a nutshell, they're doing a very good job of a 1970s education. I mean, they report, their students are more often sitting in rows and more often doing worksheets. It's just, there's nothing that has made them move the needle on their math instruction in the way that public schools have had pressures to do that. So for better or worse, there is more autonomy in private schools. And the one danger of that, I'm sure there are benefits, and you can argue with me, but some dangers of that is there's nothing really pushing them to keep current with what the profession is saying needs to happen in math education. So out of this, we had our 15 minutes of fame, where a lot of people were writing about this book. It was an interesting time. Yes, Andrew?
Go back to that last slide.
Sure.
One more.
Yeah.
So this claim about dangers of autonomy, what you're reporting is informed by answers to survey questions, so should have heard what's happening in schools?
Partly, yeah. Teachers saying, here's what I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they tell things like I have kids sit in rows?
Yes. Yeah, in the ECLSK. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So just wrapping up, so I'm certainly aware there are wonderful private schools out there, and there are, not all public schools are roses, and it's not that the status quo is perfect by any stretch. I will also say that when you're a parent and you're looking at options for your school, because we get these parents writing to us and actually asking us to testify against their ex-wife's plan to put their kid in this type of school or that, I'm not kidding, multiple times. Yeah, so a single child can benefit from moving to, a high SES private school. There is a peer effect. We've been conditioning that peer effect out when we compare apples to apples schools. And so this is not, the problem with this, the problem with saying, but kids do better in high SES private schools, and so let's put them all in there, is it's not scalable. You're going to run out of the high SES kids to put, see what I'm saying? So it's not a scalable national policy, but I do understand parents' inclination to want to move their kids to be with other college-going children and all of that, right? So And then the dangers of autonomy thing. So, yeah. Okay. And I will say that regardless of school type, there are still these persistent, disturbing gaps by race and SES and ethnicity and language, and that are there. So the last kind of big topic is gender disparities in math outcomes, and I'll talk about NAEP and ECLSK. Here's a 2015 United States Math Olympiad team. Notice anything? Okay, so there's some serious gender stuff happening, as well as it's basically white and Asian students. So, and if you look at, in case you think I'm just picking one team, there's the 2016 and the 2017. So yeah, this has been a thing. So there has been a lot of improvement in gender, but it is not done. I mean, we have not addressed it yet. So from NAEP, I learned that differences in overall, if you just look at boys and girls and look at the achievement distribution, differences are very small, tend to be about 1/10 of a standard deviation. Given that, why should we care? Well, persistent patterns are specific to math and gender. So we see larger patterns, let's say, by social class. But a lot of that is due to kids being in completely different schools, completely different neighborhoods, completely different resources. When you have boys and girls sitting in the same classroom, and you still have these disparities, it's very just weird, right? It's intriguing, at least it is to me, like what's going on. Gaps are especially large at the top of the distribution where future STEM professionals reside. So at the top 1%, by 3rd grade, it's 4 to 1 boys to girls. And so that's part of what feeds into those pictures of the math leads. 10 years out of college, women earn 77% of what men make. It's gotten better. It used to be, what, 60 or something, not that long ago. But pay disparities are largely due to fewer women in math-related fields. So when women do go into math, it's often to go teach math. They're not going to make a lot of money doing that. We all know that. So there's still these disparities in status and pay for women and men. And women are still like less than 20% of engineering and computer science bachelor's degrees. So I think in the 70s and 80s, it looked all so good. Like it was all closing, all the gaps were closing. And it was like, I think the feeling in the math communities was, this is inevitable, that just with time, this is going to fix itself. We don't need to worry about it. In fact, if you looked at the last handbook, there's no gender chapter. It just became like, who cares? It's going to take care of itself. But it really isn't. One other thing is that even though the achievement differences are small, the differences in confidence are larger. So either boys are more overconfident than they should be, or girls are less confident than they should be, or whatever. So I had a lot of lingering questions about gender from the NAEP data. And so I said, well, let's start looking at the ECLSK data to get at things like how early do these gaps appear? Are they there when they enter school in kindergarten? Do the gaps widen or narrow during elementary and middle school? Does it depend where we look in the achievement spectrum? And to what extent does achievement boost confidence and interest in math? Or does confidence and interest boost achievement in math? Right? Because these things are measured in the ECLSK data at 3rd grade and 5th grade and 8th grade, and it seemed like we could start to look at that. So here's these are the percentiles by gender. So basically what you're seeing is that in fall of kindergarten, there's almost no difference between boys and girls, but at the very top of the distribution, it's not statistically significant, but it's there. But by spring of kindergarten, it's now significant. By 1st grade, that difference is kind of spreading throughout the distribution. It spreads a little more by 3rd grade. What's weird and this is the initial ECLSK kindergarten class of 98, 99. There's another wave that's come out. We've actually analyzed that up to grade 2, and it looks exactly the same as this. Things did not get any better over that 12 years or whatever. So this is interesting. There had been hopes to follow these kids further, and they didn't because the attrition had been so terrible that they stopped. But if we look at the effect size of differences in competence, achievement, and interest, you can see that actually interest is the smallest in terms of the gap between boys and girls, which is interesting because some argue, well, if girls just aren't interested in math, then let's not worry about it if they're just interested in other things. But that doesn't seem to be at least in elementary school. Then achievement, then the confidence is the biggest. I'm going to explain these dotted lines in a minute, so hold that thought. Why are those lines dotted? Another limitation of NAEP is that measures of instruction, it's a low stakes test. If you pay 8th graders to do better, they do. You see what I'm saying? So they're not really trying their best, because if you pay them, they do better. And measures of instruction really capture what you want. Both, and this is true of all the national data sets that in my experience. So how could they be better on the national data sets? One is quit asking teachers about their degree of emphasis. In the ECLSK, 95% of teachers say there's a lot of emphasis on number and operations. If there's no variation in the variable, it doesn't help you do anything. Instead, I would like a prioritized list. What do you spend the most time in? Something to force teachers to make choices and not just say, yep, I do that, I do that, yep, I do that a lot. It's too easy. Math ed people would like to know the textbook name and how is the textbook used. There's never any question about textbooks in terms of what textbook do you use. And it would be nice to know how much teachers push students to make sense of math. And there's never variables that really are satisfying in that regard. The closest, I think, is my favorite variable about the memorizing math. Another limitation, and this goes back to the dotted line, even longitudinal data sets are changing variables in the middle of everything. This made me crazy. Okay, we're going to look at the confidence indicators. That was like the biggest gap by gender. Okay, so they said to kids, how much do you agree with I get good grades in math? It's actually small. Girls get good grades in math. They're good girls. They do what they're supposed to do. They get good grades in math. Work in math is easy. That's bigger. Boys are much more likely to say yes to that. Or I'm good in math. I can do difficult math problems. So we're rolling along and we ask us at 3rd grade, 5th grade. When we get to 8th grade, what variable do we keep for confidence? I get good grades in math. Not helpful to me because it's like the smallest thing in terms of for studying gender. That's not terribly helpful. Then they enter in math as one of my best subjects. I'm not sure why they changed it. They did it. They also did some changes with interests and got rid of 2 of them. They maybe needed to make it shorter, but I still don't understand this whole thing. So even with longitudinal data sets, another problem is that they're not always perfectly longitudinal. So then this question of what predicts what, does performance or does math achievement drive interest and confidence, or does getting a kid interested in math drive their achievement? So we did this structural equation model to try to get at this. Callie and Gamley did this with me. The upshot of this is that achievement shapes confidence more than confidence and interest shape achievement. So if you want to get kids interested in math, getting them to be good at math is a way to do that. If you want kids to be good in math, getting them interested in math, not so much. I know it's weird and maybe sad that that's the direction, but there's not a big boost for that. I would also say, though, that confidence and interest, there's just more noise, it's less stable, and makes sense with the only a few questions being asked in order to get at that. So that may be another factor here. Okay. So a little bit more on gender and math, both with ECLSK, and then I'm going to tell about, I feel like I reached my limit in what I could understand about gender and math through these national data sets, and I kept wanting to know why is it that we have this achievement gap at the top, and what's happening. And so I kept running into studies that talked about girls adhering more to teacher-given strategies, and boys kind of feeling more confident, perhaps, to make up their own stuff, work backwards, play around, like try out values of problems. And so I started to wonder, are girls' more studious approaches having more payoff for, well, actually there's evidence in ECLSK that the good girl behavior does have payoff for girls in terms of their math performance, but not at the top of the distribution. So it pays off to a point. And so my hypothesis is that this good girl orientation is limiting their bold problem-solving skills. And so we've begun to dig into this a little bit. So my research group, we're like, let's, throw the national data aside for a bit. Let's go talk to kids. And so we did this study with 76 kids in a local school. And this was a school where it's like the university laboratory school type of thing. And so they're all high-achieving students. And they're 8th graders, and their standardized test scores are roughly similar. However, there's more than one standard deviation difference in mental rotation and in their bold problem-solving approaches, as I'll show you some questions we use to get at that. But yeah, I won't say too much because I know that I'm going to be over time here, but yeah. We created this bold problem-solving scale. We still want to perfect it. It's not hugely reliable yet. But things like I prefer inventing my own ways to solve math problems instead of applying procedures my teacher or textbook shows me. Or when I'm stuck on a math problem, I usually play around with the problem for a while before examining worked examples or seeking help. So we had 6 of these items, and this is what the boys scored over a standard deviation higher than the girls on these types of items. So I think that these different smaller scale studies that have pointed to this as a possible thing that was going on, I think it is a thing, and I want to look at this more. I'm going to keep going. We have a symposium for AERA accepted that we'll work out more. This is just showing that gender is related to both mental rotation and bold problem solving in that sample. And we had this set of problems of SAT items that previous studies showed that there was a gender difference on those items. There was overall standard deviation difference for these 76 kids, but if we basically bold problem solving explained most of that. So I do think there's something here. Okay. So some final thoughts on what do national data tell us. NAEP math scores, but not the reading scores, improved a lot in the NCTM era. Gains were generally similar across racial and ethnic groups, but disparities and opportunities to learn appear to still remain. So the dream of math for all and having the more problem-centered instruction with emphasis on reasoning and sense-making being for all students, that doesn't really seem to have panned out like we would hope. The 2015 NAEP math score dip occurred in only some strands, and we need to consider the alignment with the Common Core and NAEP. Another thing that's, to recap, privatization of schools does not seem likely to improve them based on our research with ECLSK and NAEP. And then we have these persistent early gender gaps at the top of the distribution that seem to need further attention. Now, as I promised before wrapping up, and happy to take whatever questions you have, this is just a chart of the different data sets that you might be most interested in. So we have NAEP, we have ECLSK, the 98 to 99 kindergarten class. There's a new one with the 10-11 kindergarten class. And then ELS is the education longitudinal study, which if you're interested more in high school and college, these kids have been followed at older ages. HSLS is, it started in 2009. This is looking at high school, and those kids are now in college, and data are starting to come out from end of high school into college on that. So I can share these slides with Irma, and she can share them with anyone who wants them. But there's little URLs here for the public use access. So what does public use look like? Well, for NAEP, there's this NAEP Data Explorer, and you can go in and say, I want math, I want 4th grade, I want to look at this variable, this variable, this variable, and it will create tables for you, and it will let you cross-tab tables, and it's handy if you just want to go look at something. And then there's another web tool for a lot of different data sets that let you create tables and quick stats. So I don't generally use this, but it looks handy, so I'm throwing that out there as well. Okay, questions?
So
Yeah.
did you have a chance to look at the same issue in international comparison tests like TIMSS and PISA? Because based on the characteristics of the items, the results might change our interpretation.
You mean in terms of maybe how, like, for which thing?
For example, in terms of mathematics education, in TIMSS and PISA studies, US performance is not increasing, decreasing.
Right, okay. Yeah, so the question of whether that's maybe over this NCTM framework time, have they increased? I haven't, partly because whether we increase or decrease depends on whether all these other countries increase or decrease, so it's kind of hard to say, how we look. So yeah, I really haven't. To be honest, I've been a little skeptical of international comparisons, just in terms of, I've now seen some stuff done well, that I'm like, okay, this can be done well, but usually what I see is just, huge sweeping claims made about this country is better, so we should do math like they do, without paying attention to the hours of cram schools that those students are going to on the weekends, or you know, and it's, that stuff makes me cringe, and that's made me avoid it. But I think they are interesting, and I saw PISA items recently because a student was interested in this, and I thought, you know, there's something interesting about those items. They are not like our items, and I think we should do more to say what items are actually on this test. Do we care about these items? If so, we need to be worried about this, and why don't we have some of these items that are, because they're very different, and I can't quite articulate. I wish I had copies of those, because they're there's a much more real-worldy flavor to them, but not our kind of real-worldy. Like, I feel like we have fake real-worldy, and those are like real real-worldy somehow. So yeah. Anyway. Good. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about dangers of autonomy. If I understand correctly, does that mean if we give teachers like freedom to change their curriculum to like adjust their curriculum, does that mean dangerous for their students?
So in this case, with private schools anyway, what it looked like was happening is that they're using their autonomy to kind of ignore what's happened in math education in the past 30 years. So I think that type of autonomy to just hire whoever you want, whether they're certified or not, and not have any reason to really track what's going on in the math ed research land of what do we know about what kids learn or what they need to learn, I think that's dangerous. So there's no question that some teachers, given autonomy, could do amazing things, right? But I think on the whole, there's this danger there as well. Yeah. Wait, I want to go. Julia, did you?
Oh, I do, but you can ask these other ones first. Mine's about publishing in different places.
Okay, great. Okay, that's good.
I was just going to offer the brief follow-up
Yeah.
comment there is that, like, that was a good question. And I think that autonomy seems to be more with the administrators of the private schools than the teachers themselves. And in fact, the teachers have this different pressure from the parents of the children.
Yeah.
And that kind of changes the way that autonomy functions in a private school. Is that right? I was just kind of...
That's a good point. I mean, a lot of, I think what sells for some private schools is it more this traditional, you know, the uniforms, saying we're giving your kid the curriculum that you had because it was good enough for you. Clearly not all private schools. So some are much more like, we innovated there for good. But I actually did a study once on a teacher who was totally behind the NCTM standards, and there had been enough political stuff in that district that they decided the way they wanted to reform their high school curriculum was to give parents and students a choice. And so she taught like 1 hour of regular algebra where parents and students said, we want traditional algebra, and then the next was integrated with Core Plus, and her teaching switched completely. Like she in interviews would say, I knew that they wanted that, and so, and I went and surveyed her kids, and it's like, what percentage of the days, or how often, it was how often does your teacher lecture at the board for most of the class period? And it was like 80% for the algebra and like 20% for the, a bunch of these things were just really different. And yeah, so there's a case where the teacher had the autonomy. She could have done, the kind of NCTM-ish teaching that she believed in, but she only did it with the Core Plus kids. She also said, though, that using the traditional algebra curriculum, it would have taken her way too much work to revamp that herself. So when she was teaching Core Plus, that curriculum facilitated her doing a more problem-centered, discussion-oriented classroom in a way that if she was bound to use the algebra textbook, which is what she felt like she had to do with these other kids, it would have just meant an overhaul of her curriculum, and it couldn't do it in the time she had. So yeah, there's the structural things there too, other than just being the teacher. Yeah. Julia?
I was wondering, so I saw that you had an article published in the Washington Post kind of in response to a lot of other things happening in the news, and I feel like more and more math educators' work is possibly being in the public eye, especially like since Common Core, but now even like Rochelle Gutierrez's and several other now book chapters from that have been kind of put in. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the experience of publishing in a place like the Washington Post, and how do you do that, or like what has your experience been? Is it good or bad? Like what would you?
I'm going to back up to that. let's see, I'm just going to do it. Well, this is probably a very, very bad idea. Yeah, that's a great question. Almost there, maybe, yeah. So Valerie Strauss has this blog, The Answer Sheet. And what she typically does is have other people guest blog. And so I knew about this, and I think I knew about it because we had done a private public school thing there. She had asked us to do something. So for this, I just approached her and said, hey, I study NAEP. It's nice that I have little things I could say, like I was chair of the NAEP SIG at AERA. I have, here are my. So she knew I wasn't, just some crazy person. And so I said, would you be interested in this? And I basically sent her like a paragraph, and she said, yeah. And then I, in the next day, turned around like this 1-2-page thing I sent her. Because I already run the graphs. I just needed to write a few paragraphs of text, kind of short. And it's like the kind of thing that math that I think, well, it's not math that, actually I think we're probably above average, but academics in general aren't great at like throwing something out there in 2 days. But if you want to respond to something in the news, you have to do that. You have to just be ready to drop everything and say, this is what I'm going to do today. Yeah. And I think that that's good, because you need people to counter the, people who are writing other things. Yeah.
Do you have advice for graduate students who don't have things like I was chair?
Yeah, right. One might be co-authoring with somebody who does have little names that they can put, to try to, for this kind of thing. But, yeah, I mean, once you're out and have a PhD behind your name, that's going to help you as a grad student. It's probably an uphill battle getting something out there like this, but yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. Okay. Yeah. I mean, co-authoring is a great thing in general. For people who use large-scale data, it's easy to run into stuff you didn't expect, like that public-private school thing. There are many other things I've run into that I just said, I don't want that to be my next 3 years. I don't want to write about this. And I don't know anybody I want to write about this with, and so I just let it go. But there are other things I'm like, I know who I should write this with, and I then say, okay, we're going to do this public-private school thing. Yeah. Any questions?
Can I ask
Yeah.
a silly question? So, I mean, private school is better generally, but if you compare them critically, then public school is better. So, if I have a black kids, then which school do I have to send them? And still, I don't get it. How the result could be different? Generally, private school is better.
So if you just compare, do I have this one? Hold on. This might be worth digging out of here. Hold on. My order. Okay. So if we look at the NAEP achievement in private schools and public schools, the private schools are higher. Just the raw scores are higher. If we look at each SES quartile, within each SES quartile, the public schools are higher. Does anyone know the name of this?
Oh, Simpsons.
Good job, Simpsons Paradox. Someone actually put together some kind of encyclopedia entry for Simpsons Paradox and asked if they could use these graphs, because this is like such a great example. This is because, when we look at this bar, there are more high SES kids in this bar, okay? And so when we control for SES, it flips then. So if we basically are comparing apples to apples, let's say a mid-SES kid in public and a mid-SES kid in private, the public school kid's doing better, okay? But I should also say, mid-SES kid in a public school that's got also similar student demographics as this other school. So when I talk about a peer effect, if you put a low SES kid among mid-SES kids, there's a little bump that kid gets. And so that's also conditioned out in comparisons, because we want to just know what's the actual effect of the instruction and those kinds of things, not the stuff that the school really isn't controlling, if that makes sense.
You can trust recent PISA data in terms of having negative private school effect.
Is that right?
Yes.
Really?
After you put SDS.
I see in there. Oh, I'm always relieved when I hear that. Actually, so when we did our analysis, there was somebody else at, was it ETS, who had been commissioned to do the analysis, a similar analysis. And when I found out that their results were the same, in reading it's not. In reading it's like pretty much a wash. But, and what they found was that in math was a similar story, and I was so relieved when I found that out, just because it really questioned a lot of the common wisdom, and it's hard to kind of be out there thinking that I do something right.
Yeah, I did it twice. Like I ran the model twice if I did something wrong.
Yeah. Good. Is that across countries, or is that in the U.S.
In the US.
sample? Okay,
In the US.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. And actually, I would expect it to show up in PISA, because PISA is more of this sort of thinking and problem solving. I would expect, based on this stuff, that the private schools would not be as strong in that. There may be other things they're stronger in, but, and again, not all private schools, just on average. Okay. Other questions?
It's not a question, but I think the board problem solving skill is very interesting, because in my own experience, when I took the 12th grade in Korea, everybody working really hard because they have to take a university entrance exam. And boys are better because they are lazy. Because like good girl students, if they didn't get correctly, then they always check the solution, and then they think they get it because they check the solution and they think they understand it. But that's not true. They just check the solution. It doesn't mean they actually get it. But boys, they are lazy. They don't check the solution. They just try and then give up. So actually, they are thinking more. So they use their brain more. So I thought that's the reason maybe our boys are better than girls.
Let's see. Other comments or questions?
Another reason might be that girls have more math anxieties than boys. In addition.
And there's a recent study, well, it's not so recent anymore, a few years ago, suggesting that the elementary teachers' math anxiety is rubbing off more on females because the elementary teachers themselves are females, and that as a group is a pretty anxious group. So yeah, that's another kind of layer there. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more comment and question, or we can call it. Anyone have anything pressing? All right, then we will thank our speaker. And for those of you who want to ask her more questions or want to have a conversation, she has the next 45 minutes allotted just to talk to her. So.
Thank you. It was fun.